Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the university. It's a great joy always to have guests from across the faculties, but also from outside the university on these important days in the life of the university. At this university, we appoint our professors carefully, and we don't do them too hastily. And when we do appoint them, we make much of them, because I think our professors and our academics are really the heart of the university. Professor Naderali is part of the university's ambition to restore the sciences to a liberal arts framework. We are a liberal arts, humanities-led university, humanities-shaped university, but very much in the medieval sense, where the liberal arts contain all the 7 great liberal arts, of which science was a part, before the fragmentation after the Enlightenment, when science hives off and becomes a separate discipline from the arts and the humanities. In a collegium, this university distinctively is a collegium where the disciplines are in constant discussion. We frown on departmentalisms that many of the research-intensive universities I worked at, unfortunately, are plagued by. And we speak about more and more about interdisciplinarity, when in fact the disciplines are not in dialogue with each other. In fact, faculties are not in dialogue with each other. So the Liverpool Hope model is an old-fashioned medieval model, but I think it has a lot of contemporary importance, because if we're going to have a rounded graduate, we need to have a collegium where the disciplines are talking to each other. Now, people know us for our wonderful Department of Theology and for our very old Faculty of Education, but people also don't realize that this university has strong departments in psychology and good, very, in my view, impressive computer science research unit, and doing all kinds of serious work in a range of disciplines across the faculties. I don't name them all lest I embarrass them, but we have pockets of serious research right across the university. The university's ambition is to have all its teaching research informed, so that teaching is not a second order activity, but neither is research, which is fundamental to the life of the whole university. And so our professors are in the vanguard of that great vision, which this university, I'm proud to say, is daily making both national and international gains. It's a wonderful thing to think that we have 89 nationalities represented among our students, and we have some 33 nationalities represented among our staff. And it is truly an international community that we are forming and shaping every day. We meet in the Senate room of the university tonight, and this is one of our 2 chapels. And it's a symbol of who we are, that our best, most important work is done in the context of sacred space. And we're not a university for Christians, we're a Christian foundation for everybody, even those who are from other disciplines, from other faiths, and certainly even those who perhaps are not of any faith. And today our professor is a Muslim who among us is welcome and is making a great contribution in restoring experimental sciences to the Faculty of Science and Social Science. I should pause now to welcome to the university Professor Naderali's family. His wife and 3 children are with us. It's always a joy to have the family of our professors joining us. I have members here from across the faculties, but I also see, the High Sheriff, the former High Sheriff, who just stepped down 2 days ago, Professor Carty and her husband. Professor Carty is a medical scientist and who has, during her term as High Sheriff, been a great friend and supporter of this university. We also have a guest from Rome who is visiting Professor McGettrick in education, also a senior leader of an order, and it's a great delight to have you with us, sister. And to others, I noticed the external professor on one of our panels reviewing education with us. You're very welcome, Professor. You're very welcome. Also, Pro-Chancellor Monsignor Divine is with us, as there are other guests who I may be missing. Oh yes, of course, we have the Rector and Vice-Rector of Farini Institute in Modena, who are with us tonight and spending a few days at the university. This university and Farini are in partnership, and their wonderful medieval library is going to be an extension of our library here as we collaborate with this wonderful institute, where I was delighted to be invited to give the academic opening lecture this year. Good to have you with us, our friends from Modena, and Franca, of course, who wrote her thesis on the ecumenical nature of this university in Liverpool. So welcome one and all, and I'd like to invite the Assistant Vice, or Pro-Vice Chancellor for Academic Work, Professor Newport, to introduce Professor Naderali. Professor Newport.
Well, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our inaugural lecturer this evening, Professor Ebrahim Naderali. Professor Naderali is one of the more senior of a very large number of academics and scholars, some 50 of whom we've appointed during this academic year alone, that we are, as I say, in the process of appointing. And these new scholars come to us as research active scholar teachers, fully able to make a valued and very important contribution to the creation of a university where teaching is fully enlivened by research, and research is itself shaped and fashioned and formed and tested by teaching. As we know, this is a very challenging time for all the universities in the UK, and as the sector seeks to adjust to an external environment, including the radical changes to funding arrangements, there are indeed some very significant challenges before us. And I'd hope a part of our response is an even more determined quest and pursuit of excellence and the kind of academic growth to which I have already alluded. Challenges, of course, always bring opportunities, and here at the university we meet those challenges and engage with those opportunities with all the confidence and determination that our 160-year-plus history has bequeathed us. Professor Naderali joined Hope from the University of Liverpool, where he was previously a senior lecturer in medicine. His academic career spans over 20 years, during which time he has studied pharmacology as a first degree at the University of Sunderland, followed by a PhD, also in pharmacology, from the very distinguished University of Edinburgh. Upon completion of his PhD, Professor Naderali relocated to Liverpool, first taking up a postdoctoral position and then a lectureship at the University of Liverpool, but his ongoing interests in medical science and clinical care resulted in his further training, this time as a medical doctor and practicing medicine here in Liverpool. This he did while continuing to engage in clinical trials for new medicinal products. Professor Naderali strongly believes that science must move from bench to bedside if it's to be genuinely a cause for improvement in the quality of life for those who need it. And driven by this fundamental conviction and by virtue of having a foot in both worlds, that is, the worlds of both the academic researcher and that of the practitioner, Professor Naderali has worked towards the application of insights derived from science to patient care. Professor Naderali's research interests focus in particular upon obesity and diabetes, and most recently the link between obesity and cognitive decline, which is the subject of his lecture this evening. These are fields in which Professor Naderali has conducted very extensive research indeed, much of it funded via some very highly prestigious research councils and other grant-making trusts. And the CV lists some 57 scientific papers published over the past several years in places such as the International Journal of General Medicine, the International Journal of Diabetes, and the European Journal for Pharmacology, and also the journal Clinical Science. Professor Naderali has a very distinguished academic background. He has been Director of Clinical Research at MAC UK Neuroscience Limited in Manchester. He has held as I said, the post of Senior Postdoctoral Research Associate in the Department of Medicine at the University of Liverpool, and has been a medical practitioner at the University Hospital in Aintree, also, of course, in Liverpool. And so to sum up, in Professor Naderali, we believe that we found an individual who embodies the wider vision of this particular university, which is to bring together the worlds of academic research and professional practice in the interests of social betterment. We're delighted to have Professor Naderali with us, and it's hence a very genuine pleasure to ask him now to present to us his inaugural lecture, which is entitled Dementia, a Cause for Concern? Question mark. Professor Naderali.
Professor Newport, Professor Clay, and Dean, thank you very much for inviting me, and I would like to thank everyone, including the distinguished guests in here, giving me an opportunity to talk about a part of my research. And in all honesty, I can say that it is a great honor for me to stand before you here today as an academic member of the Liverpool Hope University, which is a very young yet vibrant university which is aiming to put research and teaching together for the better of the society in general. When I was first asked about giving an inaugural lecture, I had to spend a lot of time, that's a few minutes, to think what I'm going to talk about. And with the help of my daughters and the son in here, we decided that this is what we're going to talk about, dementia, which is, as I want to indicate, this is the first time that such a word actually we've been explained. Is a word that we hopefully created, and we're going to reuse it in the future. So it will be a credit for the Liverpool Hope University, hopefully. So the topic that I decided to talk about, that I thought it would be a combination of the subject which is important for the society, as well as for individuals who are affected by that. And based on that, I'm going to cause about the dementia. Is it a cause for concern or not? And what is dementia is a circulation, is a round table circulation of the obesity, dementia, and hence the word of dementia, which came out of that. So therefore, my talk would be really in the segments of talking about the obesity first and dementia, and I'm trying to present a certain evidence that linking the obesity to dementia. As a result, we're trying to use the term of dementia as the first time in here. So what's obesity? A lot been told, and we hear a lot about both media and in the public our own discussion, what obesity is about. And a lot of descriptive words used to describe what obesity is. Some of them are just actual fact, and some of them are derogatory terms. But we're trying to see what obesity actually is. In general, it is accepted that if one carries too much body fat, compared to, in association with its weight and age and height, that will definitely explain as obesity. And because of the limit of the fat that we carry, therefore, it has to be an element to quantify what is obesity would be as a representation of that. And hence, what is called as BMI or body mass index is being used to describe an obesity or overweight. In generally, if there is a BMI of greater than 30 or greater, that we consider as obesity. How BMI is calculated? It's very easy. I know the Liverpool Hope University has got an excellent record of mathematical analysis, and this is not a great deal of math, just the weight divided by height and the meter, square of the height as a meter, and that explains about the degree of the obesity. And that's categorized in a number of 4 elements: underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obese. And the latter one is actually divided into subgroups of class 1, 2, or 3. But for us as a physicians, because we are a bit slow on the calculating quickly height and weight, the scientists actually made us a chart. So we just measure the height and the weight without calculation. We put a point in the chart, and then we determine if it's obese, underweight, or overweight. Apart from what BMI index, which I'm sure some of you would agree that has got some limitation, there are other things that's been also used to describe or actually to identify the level or degree of the obesity. And one of them is the waist circumference. And as you all will agree with me that when we put on some weight and as a deposit, it's not uniformly distributed within the body. The ideal way is that the excess weight will be distributed around our hip. Nonetheless, that doesn't always happen. It usually goes around our waist, and that is actually detrimental. So if the waist fat is greater than the hip fat, there's a high increased risk of heart disease and type 2 diabetes. And the way that's calculated, that's actually the level that it describes about the obesity in women would be a greater than 35-inch, the waist size, and for men more than 30. Or one way of describing the other ones is the ratio of the size of waist to hip, which for men is greater than 0.9, and for women greater than 0.85, considered as being unhealthy. We talk about obesity. We all know what happened with obesity in UK and globally, in fact, but there's some scary statistical evidence that I would like to present for you. This is from National Audit Office, the government part, and it says in 2009, there were 22% of men and almost 24% of the women had a BMI of greater than 30. That's almost, putting together, it's about, and if you put that on overweight on top of that, that raises to about 44% of men and 35% of women here in England. And the other element that which I mentioned earlier on about the waist circumference, and that's comparing to 2009, which is 35% rise in waist circumference, is compared to that of the 1993, which was 23%. So if you compare within a decade and a half, of just under about 15 years, there's almost 50% increase in rise in the waist circumference, which is a worrying, alarming situation. And hence, by calculations that today, which we are in 2012, there are almost 13 million obese adults here in England alone. And what happens to our children? Similar scary issues with children too. Again, from the Office of National Statistics in 2009, there were almost 30% of the children aged between 12 and 15 were either obese or overweight. And if you bring that, just the obese part, that still is about 16% of the boys and about 15% of the girl. And if you bring the age ratio further down to the preschool or reception years, that still is alarming statistics of about 10%, just under 10% of obese reception age children here in England. I wanted to know where UK and England is compared to the other countries. And this is a study has been done, and which is in NHS information side. In 2007, among the number of countries, New Zealand topped the record with 62.6% of the adult population is obese. Not far behind was United Kingdom. And if you compare the UK with that of the Switzerland, there's almost 50% difference between UK and Switzerland. So what causes us? What is happening with the UK, or for that matter, New Zealand, that there are a high ratio of obesity there? Before going that, I thought that we live in the Northwest, and we want to see what happened in the Northwest. And I tried to find this statistic from the Strategic Health Authorities, which is published between 2009 and 2010. They segmented England as a country for 10 strategic health authorities. And unfortunately, we are one of the highest ones as well. The North East, which tops the league table, and the Northwest comes not far behind on the third place. And the best one seems to be the Southeast coast, whether or not to do it with some degree of social culture or social element or education. We don't really know that. But this is what the statistic that we have. We worry about obesity. Do we really need to worry about obesity? What happens with obesity? I just try to highlight a number of risk factors with obesity around. Almost all obese individuals will have a degree of the hypertension, that's the high blood pressure. Almost all obese people will have a degree of high cholesterol as low density lipoproteins, which in layman's term would be bad cholesterol. Almost all of the obese will have a low degree of HDL, or good cholesterol. And similarly, there will be high level of triglyceride and free fatty acid, which are now more and more is acknowledged are the significant players in the cardiovascular disease and the mortality. And without a doubt, almost all obese individuals will have a degree of the glucose intolerance or high blood glucose, which will lead them inevitably to type 2 diabetes. And you all know what the type 2 diabetes will bring along itself as a series of the disease and comorbidity and mortality. However, if among these markers, among these risk factors, there's also a family history of premature heart disease, or the individual is physically inactive and the sedentary lifestyle, as well as the smoking. The smoking is important to bear in mind because vast majority of the obese individual uses smoking as a means of controlling the body weight. Therefore, you might decrease your gain in body weight by smoking. Nonetheless, the smoking has a much significant risk factor for the cardiovascular disease and heart attack than the obesity alone. So if I personally want to be obese or a smoker, I'd rather be obese than a smoker. So what happens with obesity? Okay, we are obese, and what happens with that? The short-term effect that one can identify is the breathlessness. Obviously, the weight that one carries to compare to is a height and sex. Obviously, that puts a pressure on joints, on actual muscle capacity to perform. Therefore, the activity, the sudden activity actually decreases the level. There will be increased sweating because of the changes in metabolic functions of the body. And most importantly, it will be difficulty in sleeping and snoring, which will lead to the apnea, and hence, because of the lack of sleep at night, during the daytime, they will feel very much tired and exhausted. These are the short terms. What happens in the long term? In the long term, the top of the list comes the type 2 diabetes. Without a doubt, currently, UK has just over 3 million diabetics. And 98%, or between 95 and 98% of those diabetics are type 2 diabetics. And of that, almost 99% is due to the obesity. So the type 2 diabetes leads to obesity. This means that we calculated earlier on, I presented to you with about 13 million obese adults. We are talking about the sea full of an ocean of the type 2 diabetics is coming along within the next 10 years or so. Because by the time it takes about 10 years from obesity to type 2 diabetes to be diagnosed. And then cardiovascular diseases. And as a result, the increased mortality and morbidity because of the heart attack, because of the strokes, and infertility, osteoarthritis, asthma, stroke, depression, and more evidence is coming that a lot of cancers are related to obesity. But I will also consider the last one, dementia. Is dementia actually, there's a link between dementia and obesity, which will be the last part of my talk today. We mentioned about all the physical aspects of the obesity, but we cannot ignore the psychological aspects of that, especially if the person is a young individual. And they will usually have a low self-esteem. They will have poor self-image, lack of confidence, inability to cope with the society, being isolated, and hence have a poor quality of life. All that hand in hand will undoubtedly lead to the depression and isolation from the family. So all what I'm trying to picture in here, that we have roughly 13 million adult obese, and similarly young children which will be joining as adults within the next 5 to 10 years, they will have problems, not only the physical, but psychological aspect that needs to be great attention. And this is an important slide. So all this which I talked about probably sums it up. That an obese adult of over 40 years of age reduces life expectancy between 7 to 10 years. So what causes obesity? I've highlighted the 5 aspects or 5 factors which cause obesity. I'm going to start from the right-hand side one, which is the easy one. Iatrogenic one. What's iatrogenic is that us as a physician, we cause obesity to our patient. That's not because we want them to be obese, but we treat them for the disease that they have, such as a severe case of arthritis or severe case of asthma. And they are on certain drugs, such as steroids. The steroids obviously makes them obese. That is proportion of that 13 million, which is insignificant. It's a drop in ocean. So that's easy to manage that. The second one is medical reason. This is interesting one because most of the obese individuals will say, there's something wrong with me. That's the reason I'm obese. And there might be something wrong with them. As far as I know, there's only two major ones which can cause obesity. One, hypothyroidism, and one, Cushing's disease. And again, in the great scheme of the 13 million adult obese, the number of that will be no more than 1,000. So that, and when you identify that, you can easily treat them appropriately. So that brings down the number significantly as well. The third one, genes. We all blame our genes for anything that we can't do it right. It's my genes, or I have that genes, or genes that. It is true. There are a lot of genes has been identified as a cause of the obesity. In fact, every day there's more and more new ones are coming. And to my knowledge, there's roughly about between 25 to 30 genes been identified that might have a link to the obesity. What is interesting is that not a single gene has been shown to have a key factor in obese individuals' obesity. This means that those genes has to be together, at least 3 or 4 of them at the same person, and all function at the same time to make one individual obese. Not a single gene has been identified as a core obesity factor. So what makes us obese then? So why we have a nation, not just UK, but all globally, becoming more and more obese, and obesity has become not just endemic, it's a pandemic throughout the world. I put the last two, lack of physical activity and lifestyle choice together. They are very much interrelated. If I have to put my money on either of them, I'm not sure which one I would choose. Probably both. I would split my money 50-50 if I'm a gambler. That lack of physical activity perhaps leads to the obesity. The pure explanation is that with the reduction in physical activity, your consumption or your expenditure of the energy is dramatically decreased. And when the food is consumed and metabolized in the body, there has to be stored if it's not being expended. And the storage is as fat cells or adipocytes. And the other one, lifestyle choices. And the lifestyle choices, obviously, is the food that we eat. The food that we eat, the very refined carbohydrate, very refined fats. And that adds on the obesity. Just a diagrammatic scale of how consumption and expenditure of the energy happens. So that's about energy intake as a food, and there's part of that as metabolized, and the part that is not metabolized will be stored as an adipocyte or fat depot in our body. And expected, generally accepted as about 2,000 kilocalories per day, per 24 hours, is a roughly requirement. I disagree with that a bit. I think we require less than that, slightly less than that, but this is an acceptable level, 2,000 calories, and is expected for a normal being from the early morning to the following morning. We expend all that. Therefore, we can remain what we are. Obviously, if we don't expend all that, that will be deposited as obesity and will be stored in our body as the fat cells. So we have obesity. How are we going to manage that? As I mentioned earlier on, in order to manage the obesity, we need to be clear in our mind how the obesity is developed. There's two means of developing obesity, is either by increased calorie intake or by decreased energy expenditure, and they are constantly interrelated with each other. Therefore, one depends on the other one. And once we identify that, therefore, we try to manage the obesity. And with that, there's two important factors to bear in mind. One is the weight loss. The means of the weight loss would be by either healthy calorie diet or increased exercise. And preferably, both should be together. So calorie intake, healthy calorie control diet, and increased exercise. And probably the left-hand side, the weight loss in vast majority of the patients and vast majority of cases, would be achieved relatively easy in early stages. What is difficult is that maintaining that weight loss, and that's what needs to be addressed adequately. An example of the healthy dietary advice would be starchy fibers. Just briefly, I thought it would be interesting to see. I'm sure you're all aware of that. Starch, high fiber carbohydrates, a 5-a-day fruit, which I'm sure you all remember a massive drive by the government a few years ago about 5-a-day campaign about the vegetables and fruit and vegetables, and the moderate consumption of the low-fat proteins and the very small amount of high fat and sugar and salt. Therefore, that would be a healthy calorie advice. And if you're going to go a bit further deeper and try to really be effective, there's a caloric intake regimen, which is the calorie reduction by about 600 calories, and that can go as a low-calorie diet, which roughly intakes about 1,000 to 1,600 per day, and then very low-calorie, which is specifically designed for an obese patient who have a plateau in their weight loss. They try to do some level of exercise or dieting, and they didn't achieve what they need to, therefore they will go to a very low-calorie diet. And the nice National Institute of the Clinical Excellence, which is oversees the healthcare provider here in UK, especially in England. Scotland have got their own, and Wales have got their own body as well, which defines a very low-calorie diet as 1,000 or less per day. That is a very low-calorie diet, and that has to be, and it's stressed, that has to be with a specific expert support before one starts such a journey. And even further than that, the diet of about 600 kilocalories, which is extremely low-calorie diet. And the problem and the scare of that one taking such diet is that they would miss about the proteins and the minerals and the vitamins. That, again, has to be on the specific and strict supervision. If you can see that I put as a treating obesity, in the past, in certain culture, that being overweight and obese was always considered as a sign of comfort, a sign of wealth, if you put it that way. But it's not the case anymore now. Obesity has become a disease now. It's a condition, it's a medical condition that needs to be treated. And that has got either can be treated by medical or surgical. The medical, we don't have much medical drugs or medical products to treat obesity. As far as I know, there's only one available, which is not very effective at the moment. But nonetheless, a lot of pharmaceutical companies are working on the development of new medical for obesity management. But surgical is definitely as effective. But the problem with surgery is that, according to NHS, who can have a surgery, they require a certain specific criteria. One of them is a BMI of greater than 40. And if you recollect from my earlier slides about obesity, BMI of 40, that would be obese category class 3. It's a very obese individual. And if not BMI of greater than 40, or BMI between 35 to 40, that has to have other comorbidity, which usually is about hypertension or diabetes, that the surgery will help them to overcome those comorbidity as well. And again, condition as that they have tried all appropriate non-surgical methods. Non-surgical methods which I presented to you earlier on is either diet or exercise or medical intervention. And again, they commit themselves to the long-term follow-up after the surgery. But the last one is a very important point. They have to be fit and healthy enough to undergo anesthesia and surgical intervention. If someone is a BMI of greater than 40, has got so many comorbidity that would not be fit enough and healthy enough to go under the anesthetic. Therefore, that really rules out the surgical intervention as a means of managing diabetes. And even, we assume that surgery can do, and all our patients can actually go under the surgical intervention and manage the obesity. 13 million obese individuals. How many surgeons do we need to manage these patients? Effectively impossible. The type of surgery, quickly, there's about 5 means of surgery, from gastric banding, which is, I'm sure everyone heard of about that, to the gastric ballooning. And the cost of that will range from £3,500 to £15,000. In the long scheme of the managing obesity and comorbidity associated with that, perhaps 15,000 doesn't seem that much if you can manage that. But the point I raised is how many surgeons do we need, or how many surgeons do we have to enable us to manage that as a surgical means of intervention and the management of type 2 diabetes. Now I will move to my second section as a dementia. We talked about the obesity, and then my other topic of interest is about dementia. I'm sure you've seen a lot of reports or news in newspapers, in the radios, and this is from the 14th of September 2001, is big highlight and the big headline of pill to beat Alzheimer's disease. And interestingly, in 2012, in March, not long ago, the government actually committed itself for 60 million budget for 60 million towards the dementia research, which is, at the time of austerity, 60 million and earmark into the dementia research is a great achievement for the Dementia Society. But what is dementia? Again, there's a number of definitions which are used by laymen and all scientists about describing dementia, but I've tried to highlight what is actually accepted as universally and by academics and clinicians. So dementia is a loss of the mental ability, which is severe enough to interfere with the activity of daily living. The activity of daily living is washing, cooking, shopping, this kind of thing, not repairing the clock or repairing the TV. The simple, basic stuff. And it has to last more than 6 months, not a temporary measure. It's at least more than 6 months, and was not present from the birth, so it's a gradual event that's happening, and not associated with the loss of consciousness at the time of the diagnosis. A lot of forms of dementia has been identified, but the 3 major ones I put in here, and I'm almost 100% sure that the one on the left-hand side, the Alzheimer's disease, are the one that most familiar to everyone, almost. Alzheimer's disease and the one other end, dementia with Lewy bodies, are dementia which is associated with the accumulation of the certain proteins, either Lewy body proteins or beta amyloids or tau proteins around the neurons in the brain and engulfing the proteins, which results in the death of the neurons and hence loss of the memory and the function. The middle one, vascular dementia, is started to be believed that is not just the death of neurons due to the protein accumulation, but also due to other risk factors such as obesity, diabetes, and hypertension, which results in a series of events prior to dementia. And that series of events are usually about TIA or transient ischemic attack, which are the mini strokes, or CVA or cerebrovascular attacks is the full-blown strokes. And I mentioned earlier on that the diabetes and hypertension almost always are the byproduct of the obesity. Therefore, the obesity could play a major factor in the development of vascular dementia. How many dementia patients do we have in England? This is a report just came out in 2009 that the Department of Health said that more than 570,000 patients with dementia live here in England. And if you extrapolate that to the UK, that would be just around 700,000 people. And it is expected that it will be doubled within the next 30 years. There are a number of factors for doubling that, which I'll try to address that. What happens in other countries? This is an excellent study which was done almost a decade ago, and they estimated and projected that in America, Alzheimer's disease prevalence in America in year 2000, was about 4.5 million. By year 2030, which is 30 years, or from now on is about 70 years time, that will be almost doubling to 8.6 million. And by another 20 years, by 250, that will be further double to 16 million. And important is that, I'm afraid this doesn't work. If you can see, in 2000, the vast majority of the dementia patients were between the age of 75 to 85. And by 50, the vast majority will be greater than 85. The sheer fact is that we tend to live longer. We will live more longer. It means that by 2050, perhaps some of us will be around that age of 85. And that means that as we live longer and dementia being an age-related disease, therefore the number increases as the year passes on. So what happens in Europe, this is extremely well-studied paper which published just in 2005, showed the impact of dementia in Europe. In the first, if you consider the years on the bottom, 2000, 2010, it jumps up every 10 years. Just assuming the year 2000, the first column on the left-hand side shows the working age population per 10 million. That means that in Europe, around 2000, there's roughly 500 million working population. The middle column shows the number of patients, dementia patients, per 1 million. That means the number of dementia patients in Europe around 2000 is just around 8 million. And the third column, which is longer, shows proportion of the working age per dementia patient. And seems that for each individual dementia patient at year 2000, there's roughly about 70 individuals who are working. And if we just go back quickly to the 2050, we'll see that there's a dramatic decrease in the number of working age population, dramatic increase in the number of patients, and the proportional decrease in the number of working individual per dementia patient. That is have a significant impact will have on both, not just the society as a whole, as a care, but also as a cost. Cost to the society for caring the patient, cost to the society who will provide the cost of care, as well as the working population of the society. I'm sure you all know that dementia, as I mentioned earlier on, most is the old age related, there was a late onset. There's also dementia can happen in the young age as well, or young onset. And here's a study from the UK that from the group, if I divert your attention to the right-hand column or table first, you see that at the age of 30 to 35, there's about roughly 9 per 100,000 people. And going downwards by 30 years, around age 60, 65, that increases to just over 155 per 100,000 population. So that's roughly increased about tenfold or so, well, eightfold or so. And from 65, I put a blue line to 65 to 70. That's within that 5-year gap. The number of dementia dramatically increases. That table shows 1.3 per 1,000 per 100 population, which I calculated down, becomes 1,300 per 100,000 population. So if you're comparing the age, the number of patients within the gap of 65 to 70 and to 60 to 65, there's an increase of at least tenfold, roughly about tenfold increase. And that increases dramatically as the age of the patient increases. So what is happening in the country? Again, I showed the data about obesity in health strategic authorities. The same in England. I tried to show the number of the projected patients with dementia. That's by year 2030, of over 65 age patient or population, it is expected in Northwest there will be roughly about 66% of the 65 years above will have some form of dementia. And how we diagnose the dementia is usually a clinical diagnosis. Is not much of the blood test requires to be done, or not much of scanning needs to be done. It's a clinical diagnosis, and there's what's called as mini-mental state examination. There's a series of questions, and your patient replies back with the answer. Based on that, you score. The maximum score is 30, and the minimum score can be up to 0. And 25 to 30 usually accepted as a normal cognitive function, and the NICE, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, defines as a mild cognitive or mild dementia between 21 to 24, and that decreases, and less than 10 is a severe impairment of cognitive function. Similarly, if there's a scan of the brain, it shows the normal patient's brain and the Alzheimer's patient brain, you can see there's an absolute significant decrease in the size of every aspect of the brain of the patient with Alzheimer's disease, both memory function, the place that actually functions with the memory, or the one that deals with the language, and also the gyrus and sulcus, which has got functions of the memory and recollection and the coordinations and so forth. So there's a significant decrease in the size of the patient, brain size of the patient with dementia. And the prognosis of the dementia, that the disease, the degree of the disease deterioration is that from within roughly about 9 years of the diagnosis of dementia, the cognitive function impairs significantly from the mild dementia to very severe within about 6 to 7 years of life. And what happens with the affected individual is not just the person that's affected with dementia, but also their family. They have to care. And I'm sure you can just imagine that an individual that you're very close to, suddenly they can't even remember their name, or they remember who you are. How will that make you feel? Just dealing with that itself is a huge burden that one needs to deal with. And the workplace, which I mentioned, brought the data about earlier on about impact of dementia in Europe. Therefore, the workplace and the work will decrease dramatically, affecting the society and increase the care costs. This is another, I just found out very recently, I saw that the cost of dementia compared to the income of the major companies around, the revenue of the major companies around the globe. The Walmart is probably the biggest company in the world. Their annual income is roughly about $400 billion a year. And the cost of dementia in US alone is $600 billion a year. So that just shows the magnitude of the effect of dementia in society. The prognosis of the patient with dementia depends on the underlying disease. The vascular dementia tend to be more aggressive and more problematic, but usually the patient with dementia live roughly about 8 years. However, the range is from 1 year to 20 years. But on average, they live about 8 years. And as I said, the vascular dementia is more progressive because of the consequence of the vascular defect that happens in a series of mini strokes or strokes, and therefore the further and further deteriorates the neuronal function. How we manage dementia, or how we could manage dementia, there's a medical therapy for dementia, both prescription-only medicine, which are, as far as I know, there are about 4 of them available now, and there are more and more. I'm aware of the pharmaceutical companies working on more meaningful or more early intervention style of the medication for dementia, and there are over-the-counter medications that have there's some evidence that some of them do have actually helped the memory function. And I'm going to go to the last section of my talk on dementia. And as I said, this is the first mention of this word, and we're trying to see if we can make a sense of that. So what's dementia? Dementia is obesity leading to dementia. So that will how we describe dementia. I had to present enough data to convince you that obesity actually leads to dementia. And there's a study that published not long ago, there's a number of them, which shows that they follow up at 18 years of the number of patients that when they added up all the risk factors, they became just over 4,000 years. This means that if an individual is about 60 years, that's a 60. The second individual is 50 years old, that add together becomes 110 years. And the third individual, 50 years, assuming that adds on top of that becomes 160 years. Putting that, they end up with just over 4,100 risk factor years. And they follow those patients for about 18 years. And if they were obese at the age of 50, for every 1 increase in BMI, there's a risk of Alzheimer's disease increased by 36%. So if one had a BMI of 25 at 50 compared to one that who had a BMI of 28, that's the 3 BMI increase, the one with 38, that almost 110% increased chance of dementia or Alzheimer's disease in here. Similar study shows with others. And this is even more. They follow up patients at the age of 40 to 45 who were obese and had a BMI of greater than 30 versus those who are greater than 8.5 or less than 25, which is a normal or acceptable level of the BMI. They show that those patients who had a BMI of greater than 30 had threefold or 300% increase in risk of Alzheimer's disease and fivefold or 500% risk of vascular disease, vascular dementia. And that vascular dementia is a significant key part because of the risk that obesity brings with the hypertension and diabetes. So what happens if we change our lifestyle? And this study again presented, which is a 7 years follow-up, said that increased intake of 2 or 3 times a week of fruit and vegetables has significantly reduced the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And what happens if we increase the consumption of the fruit and vegetable? Obviously, that actually tackles obesity. So therefore, reduction in weight, reduction in BMI, hence improvement in dementia factor. And similarly, it says that if you come back, that this is just the fruit and vegetable, and the next one is that you eat fruit and vegetable. On top of that, you add physical activity on that, and that actually halves as a 50% or 100%, halves the risk of the Alzheimer's disease compared to those who have a lack of physical activity and consuming the high-fat diet. This slide is a good representative of the risk factors for vascular risks. And obesity, as I mentioned earlier on, say BMI of greater than 30, will have a number of risk factors, a vascular risk factor, which I mentioned earlier. All of them almost will have a high blood pressure or systolic blood pressure greater than 140. Almost all of them will have a total cholesterol of high. And if you see that the dementia odds ratio for BMI are significantly higher than both education and sex, or even the age. So what is this? The table actually shows that the BMI has this major effect on the risk of Alzheimer's disease or dementia, followed by hypertension, which itself is a consequential outcome of the obesity, and followed by total cholesterol, which again is a consequence of the obesity-related comorbidity. So if we bear in mind these risk factors, and this study shows that if there is no risk factor, the number of groups, a sub-analysis of the previous study, is that out of 283 people who had no risk factors, their risk of dementia odds ratio was 1, compared to, that means that almost identical to that of the normal general population. However, if they have one risk factor, that increases the odds ratio by 1.3. And 2 risk factor increases further, and 3 risk factor increases further. If you have a note of that, see that this increase in odds ratio of increased risk factor towards dementia is not really additive compared to the risk associated with that. To me, it looks like a synergic effect, that actually one risk factor potentiates the effect of the other risk factor towards the dementia. And this, for example, another study shows about if comparing the BMI and the waist circumference, and often adjusting for age, sex, education, and even smoking and alcohol, just shows that BMI at the age of 47, if there's a BMI of patient with AD was roughly about 27, and BMI of normal population was about 24, and that increased the odds ratio by 2. Means that for every patient of the normal population, there will be 2 of that high BMI. And a similar statistic applies for the waist circumference. Therefore, to my mind, is that calculating the odds ratio for Alzheimer's disease based on BMI or waist circumference predict almost the same outcome. And what happens with the various dementia as well? So this is one of the risk factors, so BMI of greater than 25, that's a overweight and greater than 30 is obese. You can see that the risk factor of relative risk of 1 would be normal, means that this is almost as the same as the normal population. But you see that both overweightness and obesity, both Alzheimer's disease, muscular disease, and all type of dementia significantly increase of the odds ratio between the normal population and the overweight and obese population. And I mentioned earlier on that in obesity, one of the comorbidity or risk factors of the obesity is the increase in cholesterol level. And this study shows that they followed up, as an important study in my mind, as from Northern California Medical Group. They studied about just under 10,000 people over the period of between 64 to 73 when they weighed them. They had the record of their body weight and the cholesterol levels at the age of 40 to 45. By 2007, out of those population, just over 450 developed Alzheimer's disease and about just over 100 with vascular dementia. And when they plotted that against the cholesterol level, you see that those patients who had the cholesterol level of less than 200, which is acceptable, milligram per deciliter, acceptable level, the odds ratio or hazard ratio was 1. That is almost identical to the normal accepted population. If the cholesterol level increased, that odds ratio increased significantly to 1.2. That's 20% increase. And by increased cholesterol level to greater than 240, that increased to just under 1.6. That's 60% increase in the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. This is very visible, so I'm going to skip that one. And what happens? So I presented all the data in here. So how are we going to link between obesity and dementia? And that study perhaps is one of the key studies can answer us. That insulin degrading enzymes and ApoE protein. ApoE protein is a protein that is involved in Alzheimer's disease dementia, and that the high level of sucrose consumption or sugar consumption significantly decreases the insulin degrading enzyme. That means that leads one to insulin resistant and perhaps type 2 diabetes, as well as significantly increasing the ApoE protein, which is a key marker or key player in development of the Alzheimer's disease. And also, when they measure the volume of the brain for the patients who are normal, overweight, and obese, you can see the total volume of the brain. This is right and left hemispheres, hippocampal volume, right and left, and the total volume with the normal is about 5,000 millimeter per cubic, and that decreases in overweight and significantly in obese. Therefore, that indicates the picture that I showed you earlier on, that actually with this obviously post-mortem picture, but even with the non-invasive methodology, one can determine the reduction in volume of the brain size of the dementia patients. So how this actually work together to lead us that? So as a mechanism that I put hypothesis today is that the hypertension leading to transient ischemic attack, then cardiovascular, cerebrovascular attack, or mini strokes and full-blown strokes, leading to neural death. And then abnormal lipid levels, which is high cholesterol again, and low HDL, leading to the accumulation of the proteins around the fats and the proteins, and lipotoxicity causing the neural degeneration, as well as type 2 diabetes with the hyperglycemia causing glucotoxicity, which glucose itself has been shown alone, although our body is absolutely desperately in need of glucose for our function, but high level of glucose is actually neurotoxic and causes the neural death, and as well as endothelial function dysfunction, which results in the mini strokes and the stroke, and hence neural death. And the increased adiposity, the adipose tissue releases a number of markers and the toxic elements, and which are toxic to the inflammatory markers, which are toxic to the cells, and in particular neurons, hence causing neural death and leading to decline in cognitive function and dementia. And I think that's the end of it. So what I want to say at the end is that we don't want to see this. We don't want to see that I beat anorexia. What we want to see is that I beat obesity. And based on that sense, if we beat obesity, then we don't have to say that. So it is rather to, at old age, we should be able to be danced, whether in the club or simply in the streets. And my final words: fight obesity and fight dementia. But before I finish my talk, I would like to acknowledge that there is a number of important people who in my life have affected my achievement, whatever it is. Without a say, it would be my parents and my family who are in here. And thank you for all your support in here today. Much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Well, it's my pleasure as Dean of Sciences and Social Sciences to thank you, Professor Naderali, our Professor of Human Physiology, for your informative and engaging presentation. The talk this evening will, of course, as we are based in the Northwest, be worrying for many colleagues in the university. Indeed, in the region, we've only this week seen Bootle named as the place in the country with the shortest expected lifespan. We are indeed hit by a number of factors in the Northwest. Your talk has graphically pointed to causes and fundamental changes that society must make if we are to avoid the high financial and personal costs associated with dementia, a new name we've learned to worry about tonight. This is a general trend towards preventative medicine rather than intervention-based medicine. In the last century, where the vast majority of us in this room have spent most of their life, healthcare has been about intervention, that is, getting you better. This century has seen a significant shift to health prevention, that is, stopping you getting ill in the first instance. The benefits of preventative action have been adequately portrayed by you. And indeed, approximately 1/3 of the health budget is currently spent on chronic disease. And this could be prevented by lifestyle changes, and many of which you've alluded to tonight. And in fact, this year's health budget is £105 billion. So that's a £35 billion saving to the health service. However, it's still the case that we are continuing to intervene with surgeons, as one example, not always certain that they're doing the right thing for a particular patient. That is, they can sometimes be doing the wrong thing very well indeed. I'm proud, though, to verify that our health sciences department, of which you are a member, are geared towards the preventative medicine of this century. This personal health agenda, where medicine and lifestyle changes are better for you individually rather than best for all, is becoming known as the 4P agenda. The 4 Ps being predictive, personalised, participatory, and preventative. You may have seen reports of trials of this. For example, one recent one being a diabetic man who every morning in his own home puts on the kettle, weighs himself, checks his blood pressure and sugar before the water's boiled. These are sent automatically and his medication is adjusted each day accordingly. That's according to his needs. So the needs of the one, not a need for the many, and one person having to fit that. There are no trips to hospital, no waiting in different areas. It's personalised to him. Now, our students at Hope will only benefit if they are at the cutting edge of this latest research. This is sometimes at odds with the government, who are wont to claim that we should abandon some if not all research, and focus only on enterprise activities and teaching. In truth, and indeed as we have set the course at this university, we must find a balance, as to focus on one aspect at the expense of another would mean we are completely at the mercy of government funding, the general levels of funding which have disappeared forever. However, we cannot abandon research, because this research, as you can see, benefits society. The information in tonight's talk clearly demonstrates its value, but also, and importantly, prepares our students to make a positive impact on society. And this is a fundamental principle of our faculty and our university. We at this university can evidence initiative in some of the cutting-edge research we undertake. I am proud to say that there is clear evidence of this in our faculty and university this evening. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been treated to important research by one of our senior colleagues, and I think it's one of those lectures that you often listen to and wondering whether we'll fit into one of these scales shortly. It's not one of those things you can quite listen to and sit comfortably in our places. But as the Dean has said, what is important is that a department like ours is actually making a difference. We don't have a medical school or a dental school, but I think that the health programs that we need to develop for our country, certainly for this region, are pretty obvious when you hear that kind of research being done. And there's no reason why a place like this can't make a real difference to dementia care and certainly to dealing with the problem of obesity. Normally at occasions like this we have a gift. Jackie, are you here? Here we go. In which we give an award to our new professors so that they remember the day, remember the fact that we all were with them. And Professor Naderali, if you'll come forward, please, and receive this as a memento of this evening. Congratulations. Congratulations. I began by welcoming all of you, and I missed out a few names invariably. I should acknowledge Professor and Mrs. Macon, who are great supporters of the university and make the time to be with us on occasions like this. It's always good to see our supporters and our patrons here on occasions like this. With that, thank you very much for coming, and a very good evening to all of you. Good evening.